Hi all, let's have a look at another fascinating game of Magnus Carlsen played in 2019 in the Lindores Abbey Stars. So this was round 3 against Vishy Anand. The Lindores Abbey Stars was a 4-player double round robin played 25th to 26th of May 2019 in Lindores Abbey Distillery near Newburgh, Scotland. And the time control was 25 minutes with 10 seconds per move added from move 1. So the other players, Ding Liren and Sergei Karyakin, as well as Magnus and Vishy Anand. So a very, very strong field. D4 for Magnus, knight f6, c4, e6. And Magnus doesn't mind the Nimzo engine on this occasion. So we have the Nimzo engine, the Rubinstein variation e3, black castles, bishop d3, so not committing the knight yet. The knight doesn't have to go to f3. In fact, we see c takes d5 here, and the idea revealed knight ge2. Sometimes this knight might be useful for knight f4. Sometimes after white castles, f3 and e4 are kind of Botvinnik style plan. So making use of the freer f pawn. Rook e8, bishop d2, b6. White castles, bishop d6, rook c1. Now c5 was played, so the bishop can step back to f8 on knight b5. You might think, hang on, isn't there a Greek gift here? I'm interested in Greek gifts. It doesn't actually quite work with best play. If bishop takes, knight g4 check, the king can actually step out to g3, and this is actually fine for white, this kind of thing. Even if black plays really aggressively like this, there's a refutation here. For example, like this, and then rook h1. You do have to be a bit careful, because if the king stepped back, then actually there's a beautiful line with queen h4. Check, and believe it or not, this mates after queen h1. Knight h2 check. This actually mates white after bishop g4 check. And here, if f3, there's queen takes g2 checkmate. And if knight f3, then there's bishop takes. And in this configuration, it's strange but true, but queen takes f3 is checkmate. So yeah, I thought that was a bit of fun there. Anyway, c5 was played, quite rightly, avoiding the Greek gifts. Knight b5, and the bishop tucks away on f8. We see here f3, so that's one of the perks of the knight e2. Sometimes be able to play e4. However, black played a really strong critical move here. There is a slight downside of this f3, this e3 in the diagonal in general. Black hits the dark square d4 with knight c6, a natural developing move, but really actually quite good. Here king h1 was played. e4 has clearly been dissuaded. White's centre would just crumble here after d takes. a6 kicking the knight back, taking on d4, and then here, even though c6 is loose, knight takes e4 hits d5. So this would be wonderful news for black. That would be a disaster. Yeah, black's got a big advantage there. So king h1, bishop b7, a3, and this is actually quite an interesting move in its own right, a3, not just taking away the b4 square. The perk is actually that the bishop could sometimes come on this diagonal, which is a little bit more sensitive actually for f7 than usual, with the rook on e8, and the rook's logically placed. I mean, it's logically placed on the centre file, but this is something to bear in mind. Also, white does have the potential, if white can create hanging pawns, the so-called hanging pawns on c5 and d5 with a later d takes, then c5 is going to be quite a painful target potentially. In particular, we see g6, and this doesn't actually help the backward pawn c5 potentially. We see some pressure now emerging, bishop b1 with the idea bishop a2, sometimes rook c8, and that's played now. a6, the knight drops back, bishop g7. And here, yeah, with the bishop coming here, there's a kind of weakness of the last move, that the bishop's kind of neglected this c5 pawn. Now, maybe you can consider that, hold on, isn't this diagonal and d4 going to be quite dangerous for white? Magnus does take on c5, trying to emphasize potentially the c5 pawn. So is it a classic case against these pawns that maybe knight a4, for example, later? We see, though, a really interesting idea, not knight a4 here, because, I mean, there has to be things like d4 factoring in. Really interesting move, a shocking move. And on knight a4 anyway, there's also other options like c4 from black. So can you actually guess what Magnus played in this position? It looks really a little bit counter-intuitive. If I give you 5 seconds, what would you play with white? Okay, this bishop doesn't seem absolutely brilliant at the moment. Bishop e1 gives it some possibilities of playing to h4 to put pressure on not just that diagonal, but pinning the knight will put more pressure on d5. It all comes together a bit. But isn't there a small issue here, this e3 pawn? Isn't that hanging? Now Vishy played d4. It's a very complicated position. Just to give you some ideas about this position, if knight a5, instead of taking on e3, let's just examine this for a moment. e4, this position with c4, e takes, this should be about equal. Rook takes e3. What happens critically is possibly bishop f2 to slice through to c5, and white should have a nice blockade square, but the engines actually kind of don't mind black. Even though black's got the isolated queen's pawn, there might be enough counterplay here. This seems to be about equal. So that's interesting that rook takes e3 might have simple and maybe quite strong. And here, if white messes around with knight f4, I mean, that's also potentially possible to delay that, and this should be also about equal. On rook e8 instead so pardon me, so knight a5, we've looked at knight a5, rook takes e3, c4 might be one of the strongest moves technically, blunting out the bishop. So this is interesting to consider against this very interesting bishop e1. Now here, let's say knight f4, rook takes e3. It seems as though actually black does have an important trick to do with this loose piece. Who would have thought that this piece being loose could be an issue? But yeah, this is an engine line. There's actually queen f6 actually hitting this loose piece and trying to get into this loose piece soon. So say the knight moves, so that's a big tempo gain. Then queen takes b2, looks at this one. And this is really uncomfortable for white. Say here, then knight d8, and look at that. All of a sudden, this is horrible. Yeah, c1 is a big problem. There's connection issues here. Black's getting a big advantage. So it's possible that c4 would have cast doubt on this concept. But anyway, in the game, we see d4. So there still seems to be an issue with e3, but c5 is more painful here, surely. We see knight a4, and now knight d7 is played. On d takes here, there's actually a nice trick. Bishop takes f7, because there's a loose piece on b7. Yeah, loose pieces abound in the variations here. So taking off that pawn gives white an advantage. On rook takes e3, bishop f2, and taking on c5 leaves d4 weak and leaves two pawn islands here. And if white has to give up that pawn, actually there's very interesting tactics. It looks as though this is a disaster, but white has knight e6 in this line, and then white actually gets a big advantage. So fascinating stuff. Here, if rook e7 instead, so let's have a look at rook e7 instead here. e4 is going to be very nice after bishop d5. White's getting a big advantage. So anyway, so there's some questions about e3, but yeah, knight d7 was played, but this does leave b7 is an exploitable loose piece, and it's pounced on. Bishop takes f7 with this idea of check double attacking. the king and b7. And now queen takes b7 leaves a6 weak. We have rook takes e3. Knight g3 getting out of the way, but also c5 is weak here. We have knight ce5. It's very tricky. The knight is also heading for a really powerful central square where it will help the other knight. Looking at that poor pawn there, that c5 pawn has been left vulnerable here, but the knights are huge. Bishop d2. This actually kind of self-trapped the rook, actually, knight ce5. If the rook went all the way back instead of the self-trapping, then knight e4 is truly a powerful looking position, even though it's equal on pawns, 5 pawns each. It seems as though c5 is a huge target now. Maybe this bishop fianchetto was it wasn't really helping the cause. If the bishop goes here to attack the rook, in fact white can play bishop h4, and after this is nasty for black in a different way, taking on a6, leaving c5 very, very weak. Big advantage for white. On knight e7 instead of rook e7, then knight e4 again, and just taking on c5. It's horrible stuff. Okay, so knight ce5 does leave the rook kind of trapped here now on d3. It's the knight comes to protect d2, so the rook is in a kind of trap. Rook b8. On king g8, there's a tactical move. Sorry, here. If black had played king g8, I wonder if you can spot a tactical move for white, which increases the advantage. If I give you 5 seconds here. Okay, white's play has actually bishop a5 to try and lure the queen away from the rook. Yeah, the rooks being sort of away from each other, there's looseness in black's position. And in fact, with f4 here, things are getting very, very tricky indeed. Yeah, the d7 knight might be being taken soon if the knight moves. And if rook b8, queen takes a6, looks at the rook. Yeah, white's getting a huge advantage there. So rook b8, and we have now a fantastic centralizing move. So it's not even about black's backward pawns in the conventional sense. White's installation centrally has been hugely impressive, and this rook's still kind of stranded on d3. And now there's really nasty things going on, like knight takes and knight e6. If white was given 2 moves, then bang, bang, check, winning the queen. So in fact, in this desperate position, Vishy played rook takes d2, offering, an exchange sacrifice. As an example of horrible things, there's also another horrible idea of knight g5 threatening not only knight e6, but queen f7 and knight takes. In fact, that might be an even stronger idea if white has 2 moves, which knight to plunge into the attack. So just as an example, instead of this exchange sack, if c4, knight g5 is critical, yes, threatening knight e6, knight h7, and not queen f7, that's covered by the knight, rule that out, but the other 2 are dangerous. Say queen e7, then knight takes h7, and this position bishop g5 is supported, queen d6, and yeah, it's getting really horrible for black, even though, yeah, this is even stronger than even taking the rook, knight c5 here. And this is just horrendous. If you look at this, black's just got really loose pieces everywhere. Queen e7 as another try, instead of rook takes d2. We have bishop g5, queen d6. Again, there's a lot of pressure here. Black is quite loose here, and look, that exposes the looseness of the d3 rook. Yeah, there's a lot of after which white's getting a big advantage. Okay, so this exchange stack is in a difficult position, and it's still the fact that c5 is also weak. Knight d3, okay, it does protect and hit the rook, it protects c5 for a moment. Queen e7, and we have the knight going back now. After knight f4 hitting the queen, we have queen c4, and it's in this position, the exchange up for white. with that huge knight on e4 as well, there's not even any cheapos like queen g5. The knight's controlling a lot of key squares. Vishy Anand actually resigns here. As an example continuation, he was short on the clock by this, only about 4 minutes left. So if a5, as an example, knight takes c5, yes, it's now possible to take that. And black's kind of crumbling, queen a6, and just taking on a5. Already the exchange up, but getting these 2 pawns, making 2 connected pass pawns, is going to be increasing the advantage hugely. So I'll take you back to the game end position. Yeah, I found the game a bit chaotic the first couple of times I played through it. I thought, what happened here in this game? What was this about e3 and hanging pawns? And why were the hanging pawns, especially c5, so vulnerable? So my own conclusions, in a more abstract sense, maybe the fianchetto didn't help the c5 pawn. The e3 weakness, it seems, was used as a kind of baiting by Magnus to sort of, eventually it's sort of, a rook got trapped, but there was this bishop f2 to hit c5 behind the scenes. Some very interesting play. And there was a very interesting critical variation with maybe c4 testing the whole concept, because there were some tactics with the a2 bishop being loose. A lot of loose piece liabilities maybe are more emphatic at the fast time controls. I think this game does kind of underline that the more mundane sort of tactics take a greater significance the faster the time control. So it wasn't just about the hanging pawns. It was also about Magnus centralising the pieces quite ruthlessly as well, connected to kind of the excuse of hitting the hanging pawns. But that centralisation was really quite powerful in its own right as well. And trapping the rook, getting the exchange up, and black's pawns being loose after spelled disaster for black. Okay, I hope you got something from it. And I hope you're enjoying this Magnus Carlsen series. I know he's having a rough patch at the moment in St. Louis, and that's the Rapid and Blitz is finished, but we got the classical on that. So, but there's plenty of fantastic games that Magnus has played in 2019, and I wanted to do a bit of a catch up. So I hope you are enjoying it and learning and having fun with these analysis. Thanks very much. Oh, by the way, if you want to play me and other YouTubers, check out the bit.ly link below. So that's bit.ly, that's 2 capital Y, small v, small a, 5 megabyte, like 5 capital M, capital B. So 2 capital Y, small v, small a, 5 capital M, capital B. Hope to play you at chess mode. Thanks again.